this huge presence began to form on the ceiling, or in my experience, in the sky above me. And at this point, I can't tell you whether my eyes were open or closed. But imagine if you guys have seen The Lion King, it's like when Mufasa appears to Simba in the clouds, this huge presence. So I was still in that state where I didn't know who I was, what I was, where I was. I only knew in that moment that I was bacterial in reference to this being or this presence or consciousness that was confronting me. So my name's Tamimi. I'm half Egyptian, half Canadian. So I grew up here in Canada, out in New Brunswick. But I lived out in the boonies. I was homeschooled, and I wasn't taught Arabic growing up. So when I was about 11 years old, I moved to Egypt. And it was the biggest uprooting of my life, because I went from living out in the boonies, being homeschooled, not being exposed to other children. My mom would make an effort to take us to play with other kids maybe once a month, once every couple of months. So I didn't get a lot of exposure. Then all of a sudden, I'm dropped in a foreign country, don't speak the language, don't relate to the culture. I wasn't really, Egypt's a very traditionally Muslim country in a lot of ways, and I didn't really grow up being Muslim. My parents were non-practicing, and then my parents had a separation when I was around 8 years old. My dad went through a nervous breakdown, and he found God again. So then when they came back together, that's when I started learning any concept of God or spirituality. And it was through pretty traditional, I would say repressive Muslim avenues. So I was quite devout as a, I don't know, devout 11, 12-year-old. And once I moved, it's like I don't really have a context for what's going on. I didn't really have that exposure to God. It's like, okay, yeah, we're Muslim now, sure. But there was a huge disconnect from the people around me. So I found myself always alienated and on the sidelines and unable to connect with people. And then naturally that manifested, that alienation manifested in a slew of mental health issues, anxiety, depression. So I started to break down even toward my late teens, let's say in my 18, 19, 20. I went through severe depression, wasn't sure how to integrate myself into society. And I found myself in my early 20s thinking that it was done. It was over for me. There was no way to move forward. I was depressed. I was bordering on suicidal. And I turned to essentially drugs to numb myself. So, and it wasn't into anything hardcore at the time. I would smoke hash and I would drink. And I'd use that primarily as an escape. And I had this friend that was a very good influence on me. He used to like take me to the gym. So he first introduced me to Pink Floyd. And this is where my first concept of psychedelic came from. It's like, this is psychedelic music. So we would sit in the university garden and we would smoke a joint or two of hash and we'd listen to this so-called psychedelic journey music. And I was into philosophy. I was always a heady kind of guy. So I really enjoyed those experiences, but I never really had a concept of what psychedelics were. Like I had a girlfriend who said, "Oh, have you heard of LSD and psilocybin?" And we were both in psychology at the time. So I found abnormal psychology to be quite interesting. So there's a little bit of relevance there where she said, magic mushrooms, these are, so, and I looked into it briefly. They're known for having collective, shareable hallucinations. And if you've been doing ayahuasca, I'm sure you've experienced some type of shared experience with the group in the ceremony. So coming from a mostly scientific background, this seemed a little, it caught my interest, but let's just say my interest hadn't peaked just yet. So in my 20s, I was, into the hash scene. I started to sell, And then being a little bit of a dealer, that got me more involved with other things. So other things started circling my way. My first psychedelic experience was at a rave with ecstasy or MDMA. So with the ecstasy pills, it's mostly MDMA. They usually just add something to it, some type of speed or caffeine to get it more catalytic, you could say. So I went to one of these raves and I took M, and on the dance floor, just something. I had a really good time, but it didn't really hit me how profound the experience was until the following week. I felt so much lighter. My body felt better. I was always very disconnected from my body as a child. I had a lot of pains, a lot of aches, and I retreated up to my head, which was my safe haven. I always had like stomach issues. I had a lot of stuff, but I just had no bodily awareness whatsoever. And after this night of taking drugs and dancing, essentially, I felt a looseness and a lightness in my body and a clarity in my mind that I hadn't felt probably since I was maybe 10 or 11, since I was my childhood self. So naturally, that got me more into it. So ecstasy led to a little bit of raving, led to some LSD, led to some K, and I was doing philosophy in university at the time when I first encountered LSD, and I didn't really understand it as a medicine. I probably took LSD maybe 10 or the 11th time was that psychedelic experience where the stars align and the sky opens up for you, as they say. But before that, I found it very interesting as a psychology philosophy student, and I would refer to it as this is philosophical steroids. So I'd take this stuff, I'd sit alone in my room all night, and I would just ruminate. And I'd go over different philosophical avenues. I like to think about like Eastern philosophy and concepts of God and spirituality. But that would become more relevant much later in my life because I didn't really, in the program I took philosophically, it's mostly Western, and then you just touch primarily on Eastern. So that has an exotic feel. You feel like, oh wow, that, stuff like collective consciousness, stuff like ideas like you are the divine experiencing itself through all of these different faces, whether you're a cat or a human being or a mosquito. Like these really fringe and fantastical ideas relative to our Western mechanical, more mathematized thinking. So I was much more in favor of you could say the material model, but I always had a fantastical side. So those types of things kind of always appealed to me. And I think I started taking more and more LSD because that's what was available to me. People I got into psychedelics and people are like, oh, you should take magic mushrooms. You should try this stuff called DMT. And that just wasn't available on the ground where I was in Egypt. They were very hard to get and very elusive. Believe me, I tried. But I could get LSD. It was expensive, but it was readily available. So I would take the stuff and slowly the layers of rigidity that the Western material intellectual enterprise and educational system that it had programmed into me, slowly these began to shed. And I started being open to concepts like telepathy, concepts like energy, concepts like, because I have to admit, I was quite dense. So people are just like, oh yeah, hippie people that I would say at the time would be like, I can feel your energy. Do you feel this? And I'm quite verbose. I was very conversational. For me, if it didn't exist, so they say that communication, talking, is only, the words you say is only 7%. And the rest, 93%, is everything from bodily cues to energy to suggestion to multiple factors. For me, if it didn't exist within the logical construction of the sentence, words you chose, and the tonality that you delivered with, there was nothing outside of that. I didn't have any way of conceiving or perceiving anything beyond that. I was very much stuck in my head, in my own little world. And little did I know, it wasn't even my world. It was the programming that had been, it's what I was taught was the only acceptable definition of reality by my education. I loved school. I was really into it. I I guess I latched onto that as, I guess, my religion and my creed in a way, because the what I was given was kind of patchy and unreliable. So that's kind of what I made my doctrine. And psychedelics slowly opened me up to the fact that that's just one small slice of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I feel I was really I was basically the same. I'm very scientific. I was raised by atheist parents, and I'm agnostic now, but yeah, I feel like the same. Like it kind of like blew my mind open, like, and made me realize what people mean when they talk about like I can feel your energy. Mm-hmm.
mm, yeah, it took a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, now I'm the one that people call crazy. So
You know, and
how's that for a 180?
I personally I have no problem with anybody who wants to call me crazy, because I'm happy and I'm happy.
Well, I also get it, right? I've been on the other
Mm,
side. I have no problem admitting that I was incredibly arrogant
mm,
and dismissive of anything that didn't fit into my small little box of what I considered acceptable ways of knowing and understanding. And those habits, old habits die hard. So I do get caught in those cycles. I do fall victim to that or backpedal sometimes into that. But when I'm in my clarity, I can see, you know what? I've been in that spot and I thought I was perfectly reasonable and justified. So it's much easier to have empathy and compassion for others, and be able to either ignore it or brush it off, or be there to either coach them or guide them, or just to provide space
mm,
for them to be who they are and express where they're at in their journey at any particular moment. Because I don't know about all of us, but I've certainly been there.
mm-hmm.
And I mean, I can't fault, I mean, I've walked the distance to at least where I am now, so I can't fault anyone else for having to go through that avenue. I feel like that would be double hypocritical on my part.
Mm. Um, can you tell me about your most amazing experiences, or something that stands out, like visions? What do you are you do you get a lot of visions?
Okay, so I dare not speak my most amazing psychedelic experiences publicly for fear of misinterpretation. However, I've got something that I feel is, because you gave me a few questions to go over before we got to this conversation, and I'm like, I tried to, I don't know, rehearse or find a way to communicate some of the more, let's say, psychedelic experiences, and the ability to communicate those things eluded me. So let's go with something that is uh, quite awesome, but I feel like is more straightforwardly digestible. So just a little bit of lead in. I did LSD when I was in Egypt. I got into it, and over the course of, let's say, 3 4 months, I had about 30 different LSD experiences.
Mm,
And that goes from 200 microgram full on trips to half a tab, more subtle
mm-hmm.
ruminations. So after that, I moved places. I moved from Egypt to Canada, and I spent an entire year without doing psychedelics. So it had opened up my world, and I'm like, okay, well, I got the lessons I needed. Now let me go out into the world and see what I can manage on my own. So anyway, I spent a year spinning my wheels, not really going anywhere. But I always had psychedelics in my back pocket, so to speak. So I'm like, okay. After a year, I ended up jobless, depressed, completely back in my old patterns. And I'm like, okay, well, now is the time where it's right for me to turn back to psychedelics. So when I made that decision, something in my life shifted. I had been applying for jobs, I had been looking for ways to move forward. I seemed to be hitting a wall everywhere. When I found this resolution in myself, within 2 weeks, I had a job. Within 2 months, I figured out how to acquire LSD, and I came and I started doing psychedelics again. And then within a few months, it's like, okay, now it's time to get into the mushrooms and the DMT. So we'll probably go back and talk about a little bit of this experience because it's relevant, but I want to get straight into a very profound experience that I had on smokable ayahuasca.
Changa.
Not quite a
No?
changa. It's I brewed the harmala and I drank that just ayahuasca tea. And then for the administration of the DMT, I did it the traditional way of smoking,
Yeah.
where you
Yeah,
vaporize
yeah.
and you take 3 big puffs and you hold. So this was, I had just begun, I had just succeeded in extracting my DMT and my ayahuasca. So I hadn't had a full on DMT or ayahuasca experience just yet. I had smoked DMT maybe 3 times. 2 of them I didn't get the dosage right, so I had some type of experience. One of them I had a mild experience. So this would be the first most powerful experience that I had on these chemicals where I'm like, that's the way it was supposed to work. I got it right this time. So I was having an issue with an employee of a fellow employee at work. And this guy, he's got a lot of trauma. He's not a bad guy, but he can be very, very stubborn, especially if you come at him in a confrontational way. And at that point in my life, I was not necessarily the right other side of the equation for him because I tend to get that type of reactive when someone is butting heads with me. I tend to butt back. And at that point in my life, I was struggling with being empathetic towards other people and being empathetic toward myself. So I came home one Wednesday evening and I'm like, okay, well, I've got the stuff. I feel like I'm completely decalibrated. So let me see. I'm going to drink some Harmala tea, smoke some DMT, and I'm going to see if that can set me straight. So I drank the Harmala, and I'll usually wait about an hour.
Yep.
I wait for a little bit of a queasiness in my stomach. Some people say that they don't feel anything from just ayahuasca without DMT, but I consider it to be, it's a less visionary experience for me, but it is very much psychedelic. I had taken Harmala tea a couple of times in the past before this, and I took one high dose Harmala tea where, like, literally I was seeing tracers behind everything. So even though it's not visual in the classically psychedelic way, it does have some effect on vision. And there is a notable shift in consciousness, I find, for sure. So I waited for that. Start to feel a little bit woozy. Head's a little bit clearer, a little bit of nausea in the stomach. And I'm like, okay, let's go for this. Old-fashioned style. I didn't know where to get a meth pipe at the time, which you can use for vaporizing DMT. So I had this glass almost bong, you know, the ones for smoking weed. It has a choke on it. It has the hole. So I'm improvising. I'm like, this is glass. It should work. So I load up the DMT and it's like 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and 3 Mississippi. So I hold that and I lay back in bed. So I have one window I was living in a basement room at the time. I have one window. So sun's going down. I have this not fully dark, but dimmed out atmosphere. And I lay in the bed and then Badoo. It comes on and like 0 to infinity in
Mm.
30 seconds. So I find myself in this space and I lose all concept. Let's just say all concept, except I know that I am. I do not know who I am. I do not know what I am. I do not know where I am. I know simply that I am being, and at first it's just me. And then within, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but it wasn't a large amount of time because I completely lost concept of time, but it was relatively quickly. This huge presence
Mm.
began to form on the ceiling, or in my experience, in the sky above me. And at this point, I can't tell you whether my eyes were opened or closed. But imagine if you guys have seen The Lion King. It's like when Mufasa appears to Simba in the clouds in this huge presence. So I was still in that state where I didn't know who I was, what I was, where I was. I only knew in that moment that I was bacterial in reference to this being or this presence or consciousness that was confronting me. So I reacted how any bacteria who values their life would do so. I became completely overcome with terror, feeling this gigantic presence standing over me. And then that happened for maybe a few seconds. And then I got a little bit of my self concept back. And I'm like, hold on. I'm Tamimi. I'm doing some type of ayahuasca. There's this giant presence here. I don't know what it is. I'm terrified of it. However, what I've been told about DMT is that there are entities in there that are benevolent, that are good for you. This was supposed to be something that was good for me. So I'm going to choose to put my trust in this presence. And within not even seconds, immediately, when I chose that I'm going to approach this being, this experience with trust, because I came here for help, and at least let me come with open arms and open hands, and we'll see. Is it because I had all sorts of thoughts when I was afraid? I'm like, is it a demon coming to take my soul? Is it God enacting punishment on me? Is it, what have I gotten myself into? I'm like, hold on. This was the precedent. I'm going to choose to trust. So within that, things mellowed down. And it was still it was a very awful, not awful, as in I was full of awe. It was very, like being in the presence of
Like
God,
awesome.
where you feel very, just small. So my senses are coming back to me a little bit, and I can tell that this is a feminine experience. So me, at the time, I had developed a lot of what they call the psychedelic ego, the spiritual ego. Like, I've had a few experiences. I know better than thou. And then that starts to manifest itself in, let's just say, not the most compassionate and open mindset. So this being feminine, I believe nowadays that I was in contact. This was Mother Ayahuasca. Very strong feminine presence. And it says, you, little Tamimi, you want to be Mr. Psychedelic Grandfather. You want to be the shepherd of mankind. You want to be there saving people. It's like, who are you? And the tone was not, it was harsh, but it was not unloving. It wasn't discompassionate. Who are you? What do you know about being a human? About being a friend? About being a father? About being a mother? And then a vision overtook me where I was, I don't know if it was a admonition for a past life or a VR experience. All I know is that what I can take away from it. And in that vision, I saw myself as, I'm not sure if I was a woman, but I was a being. And I had this baby. And I had to take care of this other life, this other creature. And in that experience, this other creature's life was more important and more precious than my own. And I can't say that I remember or I'm able to embody it in my now, in my masculine body and in my day to day experience, but in that moment, I knew what it meant and what it was like to be a mother. And then it's like, okay, you're having a problem with this person. You've been coming at him essentially like an asshole. So I saw this coworker of mine, and he was sitting on the sidewalk and he was crying. And rather than being, masculine and discompassionate, I saw a vision of myself going up and I sat next to him. I put my arm around him. I was like, what's wrong, man? What's eating you? Where's all of this animosity coming from? Who did what to you? You know? What's wrong? How can I be there for you in that way? And I have to say, it really put me in my place. It really showed me how having a more compassionate human approach to things. And it really showed me how not there I was to be, because at the time my aspirations were to be a psychedelic integration coach. And it really showed me how much distance I had to walk and how much emotional growth I had to go through before I could come anywhere close to that space. So after these two visions, the presence faded out, and then I was greeted with a beautiful spinning geometry kaleidoscope on my ceiling for, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. The whole experience lasted somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes. And then it phased out. And when I came back, all of the tension and anger and whatnot in my body was gone. I felt completely renewed and refreshed. I felt the way that back in the day, which I was having trouble connecting to at the time, one of those 200 microgram LSD trips would make me feel like I'm reborn, like I was my childhood soul in my now current body. And yeah, that was my first real DMT ayahuasca experience.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for that story. That's an amazing story. You were talking a little before about taking breaks sometimes and like kind of sometimes moving away from just taking psychedelics a lot and focusing on other techniques sometimes for integration, grounding.
Okay, yeah, so when I did my initial bout of psychedelic taking, it was about, let's say, 30, in the course of 4 or 5 months, I did 30 LSD trips, multiple MDMA experiences, and I had, let's say, between 5 and 10 very powerful ketamine experiences as well. And at this point, I was not mixing psychedelics or overlapping energies. But then I moved to Canada and I took that year off. And the reason I took the year off is the message that was given to me was healthy body, healthy mind. And I had been a smoker a lot up until that point, heavily for, let's say, 2 or 3 years. And I felt like my physical hardware was not able to keep up with the emotional and the mental upgrading that I was doing it to myself. So it's like, okay, let me go work more on the physical side of things. I feel like I kind of got sucked too much into the spiritual dimension and not necessarily losing grip on reality, although there was some amount of that happening. But there was a clear disparity between how big my mind and spiritual side was growing and my body's ability to interface and get along with and integrate that essentially. So having come from a past where I was using drugs as an addiction, as a crutch, I've struggled over the years because I started when I was about 23 years old and I'm 31 now. So I've taken, other than that 1 year There's only been a period of maybe 5 months or 2 or 3 months at a time where I have not taken any psychedelics or marijuana or anything in these last 8ish years. So I struggled with my addictive tendencies. So over the years, I had over relied on psychedelics. I've had periods where for lack of a better way of putting it, I think I fried my nervous system a little bit by doing too many high energy, high level experiences without grounding and strengthening and nourishing a strong body to accommodate and accompany those. So the more that I took stuff and the more that I found myself experiencing the negative backlash of overusing psychedelics, the more that I turned towards, and I feel like it was, I have to credit them in a big way because I feel like they funneled me more towards other avenues of spirituality, toward yoga. So these days I'm into very much traditional Indian Tantra and Indian yogic practice. Particularly the Agora school, if people are familiar with that. So the Agoris, if I can just shed some light there, the Agoris are known for doing all sorts of weird practices. And lo and behold, they're the ones who are known for using consciousness altering substances the most.
Sorry, do they paint their face
Yes.
white?
And hang out in the
Yeah,
cremation
okay.
grounds. They're generally devotees of Shiva
Yeah, yeah.
or Kali Devi or some of these more fiercer manifestations of Hindu divinity. And they're known for being, you could say, the really fringe weirdos of society. But underneath all of the agoric practices, whether it's eating your lunch out of a human skull, or painting your face, or sitting overnight naked in the cremation ground, what lies at the heart of agoric philosophy is that divinity is in everything, and everything is sacred. So their approach to extreme practices is an attempt to desensitize oneself or decondition, so to say, not desensitize, it's to decondition our pre existing notions of what we look at as good and bad, as holy and unholy, as filthy and pure, as profound and profane. Because at the heart of it, they believe that all is one and that an insect is as equally divine as an angel. A human being is equally divine to a dung beetle, and so on. So I would say they get a lot of bad press, but at the core of their philosophy, it really is something quite beautiful. So, and I feel like that correlates very strongly with at least what the psychedelics have taught to me, that there is divinity in
Mm-hmm.
everything, and that the world is made of consciousness, and consciousness pervades all because, in my understanding, there is nothing else. Some of it's a lot more densely folded. That goes, everything from the desk you're sitting at to maybe some of the more dense human beings, myself at times. But yeah, so that's some of the yogic stuff that I got into. So I've been trying more and more to limit my to go for quality over quantity. So I think it was Terence McKenna who said one of the issues with psychedelics is taking too little too often. And he was the type, and I guess I am as well, who aims for spectacular episodes of intoxication. Although I do see the value in microdosing, mini dosing, these types of things. But with anything that you use consistently, there is a tendency to become dependent on it. And I ultimately see the beauty of psychedelics as, like, if we contrast them with, let's say, modern day antidepressants. Here's something that you can take that'll fix you up and recalibrate you and send you on your merry way. And it is good to come back and check in
Mm-hmm.
from time to time, but it's not something you're dependent on day to day. The the mode of relation is not one of dependence and enslavement, but one of liberation. which also feeds back into yogic principles. So I've been really trying
Hmm.
to respect the medicine and use it in the way that I think uh, does honor to that principle, which I feel like I have not lived up to in the past, regrettably speaking.
Hmm. In my opinion, this is the importance of dieting, of leading up to a ceremony, of like cleansing your body, not relying on anything until you get to a ceremony. It's kind of what I live by. Do you what kind of diet? Like, tell me about your diet. Do you diet?
So yeah, these days I've been okay. So in the past, I experimented with vegetarian, pescatarian, veg, non-veg, meat. Both of my brothers are working in the fitness industry. One of them is a vegan. The other one eats more traditionally, so meat. So lots of conflicting opinions from the health professionals in my life. But what it comes down to for me is I believe that diet is all a matter of which energies you want to put into your body. If I can reference Agora, a lot of yogic practices will preach you should have a vegetarian diet, you shouldn't eat animals. Agoris, they will eat meat, they will drink blood. There's even agoric rituals where they consume human flesh. And the idea behind that is you are essentially an energy resonator modulator. And depending on what you're trying to achieve, you can put different energies into the system. So I think in terms of diet, I diet appropriately for what I'm doing. But these days, I'm on a very restrictive diet. So I fast mostly 24 hours. I eat once a day, primarily vegetarian and vegan food. That's mostly courtesy of I live with my vegan brother, so most of the stuff we have at home, I just got used to cooking vegetarian and vegan meals. I'll have butter or cheese, but and then on the odd time when I go out, I'll have a cheeseburger or I'll have meat. And every time, I'm not perfect with this, but every time meat, whether it's chicken or pork or whatever, it comes in front of me, I try to thank the animal, attune myself with its energy, and when I'm taking that, I have a generalized prayer that I say before I eat anything. And the words are different every time, but what it comes down to is I invite you as a life to come and be part of my life so that together we can be more than what we are. So if that animal, karmically speaking, there's a principle, if I can tangentialize here for a second, there's a principle in yoga where they do, for example, animal sacrifice. And it's said that if the sacrifice is done properly with the right respect and the right consciousness, then it benefits not just the people doing the ritual, but it also helps to bring the soul or the consciousness of that animal to a higher level as well. It's mutually beneficial. So I strive for, in all my interactions, whatever I'm consuming and putting into my body, whether it's a medicine or a drug substance, or food, or sweets, usually I'll say a prayer if I'm remembering and if I'm not caught up in my human needs and my hunger, which does happen from time to time, more often than I'd like to admit. I will try to attune myself to the energy of what I'm taking into my body and put the intention for it going through me to be a mutually beneficial process for both of us. So nowadays I'm doing a highly restrictive diet, mostly because that it makes me feel lighter, and I feel I need less and less food. Yeah.
Hmm. My experience with dieting is that it like changes the way you feel and the way you think
Mm.
once you get into it. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Kind of.
So karmically, the yogically speaking, there's a principle that whatever you have in it has karma in it. And let me just say a few things about this word because it can be there's many ways to interpret it. But I look at karma as it's the accumulation of conscious software, you could say. So if you're eating a cow, you're getting some type of energy, emotionality of what it means to be a cow. If you're eating a fish, likewise, a plant, likewise. So the yogically, the argument against eating meat and other animals is that they have a more refined emotional karmic substance, which takes not only takes longer and more energy for you to decommission in your body and repurpose it to make you, but as long as that's in you, it provides a certain amount of energetic interference. So imagine you're eating different animals, different creatures, different lives. As their physical stuff processes in your system, so too does their energy body, their soul, you could say, their consciousness. And that will, so long as it's being run through your body, it's going to provide, it's going to try to live and act itself out through you. So you can imagine if you're eating multiple different things, it comes to the point where you're driving a car, that's my body, and it's trying to go in 5, 6, 7, 8 different directions at once. So having a restrictive diet, or because this is a big thing in, I believe, Amazonian shamanism as well, they will say dieta, dieta, dieta. So for certain plant medicines, Toei is one of them. It's a very considered to be a very jealous plant. It's considered to be a very, you could say, demanding master. So for people who enter into a relationship with that, it will say, or what it comes down to is, you may not have this, or this energy within you, or it creates conflict. Luckily, ayahuasca and mopacho are, those spirits are considered to be friends with the Toei spirit, so they get along. You can take those together. So I kind of use this as a broader metaphor for, actually don't look at it metaphorically. It seems pretty mechanically mathematical to me, where it's like you're on one channel, the more energies that you add to that, the more fuzz you get in the channel. So that goes back to what you were saying about how dieting can make you a lot clearer, a lot. But what I want to stress, in my own opinion, is that it's not whether you eat meat or whether you eat this or that or the other thing. Uh, Specifically, it's more about what energy you're taking in and what energy you're trying to attune yourself to. So it might be better for someone in the UFC who wants to have a little bit more aggression to eat meat, to eat animal content. That might, for example, someone who's going for a more sattvic or peaceful diet, it might be better for them to only have a vegetarian diet. It's, for me, it's all about what you're looking for and what you want to achieve. So I don't think there is a one size fits all answer for anybody, because we're just scratching the surface with how this stuff actually works on a scientific level. So that's my experience. But for me to say anything beyond, I think it's open and there's a lot of different ways you can take it, would be stepping out of the realm which I have experience and knowledge. So let's leave it at that, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many differing views on this, but I think you're onto something. It's really a personal thing. Are you aligned with the way you think you should be living? Are you doing what you think you should be? Are you eating what you think you should be? I never thought that coming when I was not dieting, I looked at dieting and I thought, oh my gosh, I could never do that. But now that I'm in it, it's like my mind is different. I'm like, it's no problem anymore.
Would you want to go back?
So no. Well, no. Now that I know how it feels, if I went back, when I do go back, sometimes if I go on vacation, I'll go back and I just feel like crap because my body is like sensitive to this all the crap that people eat.
You know what I find most
So
intrusive? I don't mind living energy. So like animal products is fine. Processed stuff and chemical stuff, I find that gets me a lot worse than, I don't know, any type of meat product or any type of living thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's crazy the chemicals and the names of like I don't if I can't read the name of it, if I don't know how it sounds, I'm not
You
eating
don't
it.
know the
I'm not
ingredients in
putting that
your
in my body.
ingredients? That's a problem. Okay.
Amazing. Tell me about. I just want to ask you probably one or two more questions. Tell us about ketamine because I've never taken ketamine. I'm interested. How was
There's
it?
so much to say. Ketamine.
Hmm.
This last year, ketamine has been my psychedelic of choice. Actually, so ketamine is what I would consider. It's less visionary. It's less externally visionary. Uh, but it's very good for exploring deep inner spaces. So if I had to put it somewhere on the psychedelic spectrum, have you ever experienced or read experiences of taking 5-methoxy DMT, 5-MeO?
I've heard. Oh, 5-MeO. Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
5-MeO.
Bufo.
Have
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
taken it?
Hmm.
Or have you taken the
Yes. Yeah.
bufo? Have you
Just
been to a bufo ceremony?
smoked. Yeah.
The frog venom?
Hmm.
I don't know if it's venom.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
It's crazy.
Okay, so in
Crazy.
my understanding, or what because I have not actually taken the stuff. I've had one experience with yopo seeds, uh,
Okay.
where I prepared a snuff and I took that and I did have some type of experience, but it was mild.
Hmm.
So what I've read from those things is that takes you to a space in consciousness which is so fundamental. It precedes the notions of space, shape, and color. So it's a lot less visionary by default. But you do get into some type of consciousness stream where everything connects just in a non spatial kind of way. That's what I've read. Now, in my experience, I've taken my enough changa, smoked DMT, ayahuasca, psilocybin experiences, LSD, where you get a very geometrical and spatial reference, where it's visionary, where you can see stuff, feel stuff, where there's space and presence. I would say that K is a very reliable method for getting somewhere between here and here.
Hmm.
So it's somehow more abstract than, let's say, even LSD or ayahuasca type visions. But it's more concrete than 5-MeO visions. So it's a very interesting space. On top of the fact, one of the things that I like about K is, have you noticed that there is a certain continuity in your psychedelic experiences? So, for example, the first time I smoked DMT on its own, so taking aside that smoked ayahuasca experience that I shared with you earlier, just smoking DMT, I find that it's like an ayahuasca trip compressed into 10 minutes. But the compression is such that
Hmm.
it's so fast and so much information that I struggle to be able to remember it. It's like a dream. When I come back, it quickly fades. When I remember my DMT experience is on the come up of my next DMT experience. Once I re enter that space, those memories and the ability to connect to that becomes available to me once more.
Hmm.
So I found this
Hmm.
with several different psychedelics, that it's almost like you have some trips that are the sequel to other trips, because getting back in that energetic space allows you to have a certain proximity, which is allows you to recall those events. So ketamine itself has such a, it doesn't feel like LSD, doesn't feel like MDMA, doesn't feel like ayahuasca, doesn't feel like marijuana. It does has its own particular energetic feel. So I found that there's a certain continuity with the ketamine psychedelic experience where I was able to have, I would say the first 5 or 10 times I had a ketamine experience, it was like all a serialized episodes in one large trip. So because of the distinct feel of the energy, it really allows you to have, let's say, a continuing psychedelic revelation over the course of many trips. Even some of these were years apart. Because my relationship with ketamine is I will do, this year was an exception. I did more ketamine this year than I usually do, but usually it'll be every year, year and a half. I will have a period where I have, let's say, 5 or 6 very intense ketamine experiences, and then not again for 4, 5, 6, 7 months or a year. And then when I'll come back, there will be a, you could say, a bout of ketamine experiences, and then moving on. So one of the things that I noted for me especially was this continuity in the trip because it's such a unique space. Now, also, there's no coincidence that ketamine became popular as a dancing drug. So we've been talking more about the spiritual and the psychic aspects of psychedelics, but it has such a profound effect on the body as well. So I'm someone who
Mhm.
very, very tense my whole life, very tightly wound. And I found that when I would do K, because I started doing K in a rave environment, and I would dance, it's like ranges of motion, abilities for my muscles to relax that I never even conceived were possible at the time became open and available to me. So if you're someone who
Mm.
does yoga and is into expanding your flexibility, there's a lot of room for experimentation with taking ketamine in a mild dose to the point where you're not completely anesthetized in spirit dimension, and working on your body, because I think at this point in the psychedelic journey we've all become maybe not familiar but at least aware of the concept that our bodies store emotion. And at this point, I'm sure you've become aware of there's certain points in your body that are what do you call the problem areas. So for me, there's my right hip, there's my back heart here, my right shoulder. There's a few ones that keep coming up, and you might be more or less aware of what particular traumas or pains you have stored where in your body. So I will also use ketamine to target and work on specific blockages that are stored in more of a physical nature than, because like your body, and in yoga they have the 5 different bodies, and they go from, this is the gross body, the food body. So then you have the mental body and the emotional body. So you could say it's like the colors of the rainbow. So as like our chakras, for example, the reason that they're the same correlation as the colors of the rainbow is because it's densities of light going from red to violet, which are progressively from the earth up to the sky, from dense to progressively less dense. So certain patterns are stored, habits, because if you're looking at everything, because I like to look at everything as waves and energy. So if things bigger, lower frequency waves and stuff are going to be stored in those chakras that are about denser nature, i.e., your roots, the red ones, the red ones, the orange ones, the yellow ones. And then other thought patterns, things that are more subtle, are stored, you could say, in the mind or the emotion. Now, obviously, there's an intermingling and a connection between body, mind, and spirit and emotion. But I find that certain traumas or certain issues will have either more of a physical presence or more of a mental presence or more of an emotional presence. Now, there's no clear separation, so it's kind of a little bit of a wonky science if you're looking at it that way. But for stuff that has a very strong physical presence, I find that K can really help if something's stored in a way where it's so tight or clenched up that there's physical pain to a degree where you're not able to access even the emotions. I feel like it can really be effective at loosening things physically and lightening things up to the point where you're able to connect more with those things on an emotional level and target them let's say, from a conscious mental space rather than having to work them out physically. That being said, the reason that I got more into yoga in the physical practice is I always think that a bi-directional approach, coming at things from both sides, works best. Okay, so
Side note, what you're talking about reminds me of I used to go to yoga class on shrooms.
hopefully
um,
not too many shrooms.
like no, no more than a medium dose. In between light and medium dose, and it was like it would. I had amazing yoga set. I moved in ways I never thought possible. It was amazing. hmm Um, okay, I just want to ask you to wrap up for people who are getting into this world or people who have never even done any of this. Do you have anything that you can briefly, any advice you can give?
Well, I certainly don't recommend cooking ayahuasca in your basement and experimenting on yourself with it. uh, okay, so there is a great bodies of information online, and generally, what most of them will say is find yourself someone who knows what they're doing, and it's a lot easier to find the others these days. There are psychedelic communities, there are pages on Instagram, there are websites, there are forums. You can check for a lot of intelligent psychedelic discussion. And if you do want to get more into the scientific aspect of making the stuff yourself, or you can check out the DMT Nexus. You can check out Erowid.com. There are various other forums available. There's plenty of stuff on Reddit. But just a few, pointers, because it's also easy to get lost in a sea of information that fast, is you want to do your homework first. You want to have some idea of what you're walking into, but don't feel so compelled that you need to know what you're getting yourself into, because it's very hard to understand what a psychedelic experience is until you've actually experienced one. So I would say brief yourself, but try not to set up too many expectations. Have an idea what you're looking for out of the medicine, have an idea why you're approaching it, and try to use your intuition as to what feels right. Nowadays, psychedelics are coming at us from all different directions. I get ads on Instagram at least once a week of random websites selling LSD and shrooms and this and that. So really try to use your gut to see which ones are right for you. I'm a big believer in the fact that what people need will naturally come to them, and it's not always good, unfortunately. But now we're so inundated with stimuli that it's always important to take a few breaths, take a step back, and kind of feel which one of the paths presenting itself makes the most sense for you and resonates most strongly with you. Now, when picking a shaman, or not even a shaman, as a mentor, or even a friend, or even a person whose presence you choose to be in when doing psychedelics, make sure it's someone that you naturally feel good and comfortable around. Someone that makes you feel like you can be yourself, someone who is understanding and can be there for you if you get into a problem state or start to express, let's say, less socially acceptable aspects or faces of your personality. And yeah, I think that pretty much says it.
hmm It's good advice. Um, Last thing I love to ask this question: should people be allowed to take psychedelics if they choose to?
I think I'm a radically into freedom. So I think everything that anyone chooses to do is their business. Now, it's important to be respectful of others. Like anything from psychedelics to suicide, at the end of the day, that's your prerogative. If you're resolute in your decision and know what you want, it's no one else's jurisdiction to stop you. That being said, we all have people who care about us and who have our best interest in mind. So it's very prudent when looking how to move forward in anyone's life for us to weigh our own opinion with theirs and try to come to some type of middle ground. Now, in terms of specifically psychedelics, I think the concept of telling someone what food they can eat and what food they can't eat is absolutely ridiculous. If I want to huff paint, that's on me. Probably not a good idea, but at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. And I'm sorry to use such a maybe ridiculously fringe example, but I just want to highlight how how ludicrous it is that we live. I'm living in Canada, so we live in a society that claims to uphold freedom, but would sanction the types of food or things that you can put into your mouth, and behind closed doors, nonetheless. If you want to have no
Mm-hmm.
smoking in public, that's a public collective decision. If you want to have a no drinking on the subway, that's within other people's jurisdiction. But what people do within the privacy of their own consciousness and their own space, provided that it's not polluting the atmosphere or destroying the planet or there's some reasonable excuse for it, is entirely their business, in my opinion.
Mm. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, and the good vibes. I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having
I
me.
love talking about this. I could talk about this stuff forever.
I just want to say that I had been
Mhm.
listening to the Ranveer Show, which is an Indian podcaster. Before you asked me to do this, I've been listening to his podcast for a few months. He talks a lot about Hinduism. I learned a lot of the stuff that I know about Agora and Yogic Tantra from there. And I was thinking, you know what? I'd really like to be on a guest on a podcast one of these days. And I guess someone out there heard me because it was within that month that you texted me. You're like, "Hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast." And I was like, "Someone's listening."
You know what? You were not the first. You're not the first person that told me that they were just thinking about that, and then all of a sudden, like I contacted them or something. It's really crazy. It's really crazy. It's cool. Anyways, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.